May 16th, 2026. Mark Rutte steps to the NATO podium in Brussels, cameras rolling, and he says, on the record, captured live by Reuters and CNN, that the transatlantic partnership is facing a risk of structural breakdown. Not strained, not tested, not under pressure. Structural breakdown. I'm going to explain exactly what those two words mean, why they're the most alarming phrase ever spoken at a NATO podium, and, more importantly, what they reveal about where American military power actually stands right now. Because the headline is two words. The story underneath is a 3-month collapse hiding in logistics documents, diplomatic cables, and one very tense April 8th meeting at the White House. If you want analysis that goes past the headline and tells you what the official framing won't, subscribe right now. One click, then stay, because what follows structural breakdown is the most important story about American military power since the Iraq coalition fractured in 2003. Here's why the word structural is the one that matters. Rutte didn't say political. He didn't say tense or difficult. He said structural. And that word is doing enormous work. A structural failure isn't two leaders arguing at a summit. It's not a bad press cycle. A structural failure is when the load-bearing wall cracks. The building doesn't fall immediately, but from that moment forward, every architect, every engineer, every adversary who can read a blueprint knows this structure is no longer what it was on paper. That's what Rutte described. Not a disagreement, a crack in the foundation. So what caused it? Here's the documented timeline, not the Twitter version, the operational one. February 28th, 2026. Operation Epic Fury begins. The Pentagon requests enhanced access to European bases, refueling, rearming, staging, for what will become a multi-month conflict with Iran. The responses come back within days. Spain, no. Rota and Marone Naval Station will not be available for Iran-related operations. The Prime Minister says it publicly at a press conference, citing no UN mandate and no NATO consensus. Italy, no. Sigonella denied for American bombers. Procedural and political objections, documented formally. France, no. Overflights carrying munitions to Israel blocked. Formal diplomatic communication to Washington. 3 countries, 3 public refusals, all in the same month, all legally grounded in the same argument. Article 5 of the NATO treaty covers collective defense after an attack on a member. Iran had not attacked a NATO member. Washington launched a preemptive strike, and it launched it without asking. That last part is the one the official American framing keeps skipping. Washington didn't consult. Washington informed Allied capitals hours before strikes began. Pause there. Because the difference between consultation and notification is not a technicality. It is the entire reason the alliance fractured. Consultation is the process that produces domestic political cover. It's the meeting where a European Prime Minister can tell their parliament, we were part of this decision, we shaped it, we stand behind it. Notification is a phone call that says, we're doing this tonight, thought you should know. You cannot call it betrayal when an ally declines to provide support for an operation they were never asked to join. What you can call it is the predictable consequence of treating allied governments as audiences rather than partners. Trump called them cowards on Truth Social, then upgraded to stabbed us in the back on Air Force One returning from Beijing. Then came the announcement, 5,000 troops withdrawn from Germany. Spain, Italy, and France placed, in the words of the Wall Street Journal, on an internal administration naughty list. And the Secretary General of the alliance those countries belong to walked to a podium the next morning and said 2 words that can't be unsaid. Now let me show you what it actually cost, because this is where the abstract becomes concrete and where most coverage stops short. Sicily sits at the geographic midpoint of everything, between American carrier groups in the Gulf and the continental United States, between European ammunition stockpiles and active theater operations. Sigonella has been the staging hub for American Mediterranean operations for decades. Losing it doesn't stop the mission. It forces the mission to be run at greater distance, greater cost, and reduced operational efficiency on every single logistics cycle. For every single week, the denial holds. Every additional mile of denied airspace burns fuel. Every rerouted sortie adds time. Every extra hour in the air increases munitions consumption. None of this appears in press conferences about the campaign proceeding on schedule. All of it accumulates, invisibly, in the logistics budgets and sortie planning documents that operational planners live with every day. That cumulative cost is what Rutte meant by structural breakdown, not the political argument. The operational weight of the political argument being maintained over months, compounding in every logistics cycle, every fuel load, every rerouted aircraft. April 8th. Rutte meets Trump at the White House. Both sides later describe it as frank and open, diplomatic language that means one side said things that made the other extremely uncomfortable. Rutte emerged to tell CNN that Trump was clearly disappointed with many NATO allies, that some had been tested and failed amid the Iran crisis. Tested and failed. Those three words from the Secretary General of NATO, spoken in a non-classified setting, on camera, are the most extraordinary sentence any NATO Secretary General has ever publicly allowed himself to say. It is the institutional acknowledgement that the alliance, when tested by a specific combination of American offensive operations and absent prior consultation, produced a result that fell below the standard the alliance is supposed to meet. Here's where the story stops being about Iran and starts being about something far larger. Every American contingency plan for the Taiwan Strait, every one, is built on an assumption that European forward basing is available as a global logistics backbone. Munitions manufactured in the U.S., staged through European facilities, forward deployed to Pacific positions. That's the architecture. If that architecture is now conditional, if the next operational request will generate a new round of naughty list calculations in Madrid, Rome, and Paris, then every Pacific operational timeline has to be recalculated. Not because European allies will be asked to fight in the Pacific, because the global transit network that sustains Pacific operations runs through European soil. Japan, South Korea, and Australia are watching this, not to see if European allies will show up to a Taiwan conflict. They won't be asked directly. What they're assessing is what the NATO fracture reveals about something more fundamental. What happens when a host nation's domestic politics resist American operational needs? If Spain, Italy, and France can publicly refuse base access, and the consequence is a naughty list and some troop redeployments, then every Pacific ally is now running its own calculation about what their refusal would cost. That assessment is happening right now in Tokyo, Seoul, and Canberra. It won't appear in alliance solidarity statements. It will appear in budget lines for indigenous strike capability, in requests for more specific American commitment language, in the careful way Pacific governments choose words when asked about reliability. Here's the case against the American position, and it's a strong one, so it deserves to be stated honestly. Article 5 is a collective defense obligation triggered by an attack on a member state. Iran did not attack a NATO member before Operation Epic Fury. European members have a legal right, and in some cases a domestic legal obligation, to decline participation in offensive operations that lack UN mandate or NATO consensus authorization. Washington skipped the consultation process. Consultation is what generates domestic political buy-in. Without buy-in, no European prime minister can survive the political cost of putting their country's military infrastructure in service of a war their public didn't endorse. The political cost of association arrives immediately. The diffuse economic benefit of facilitating a faster resolution arrives later, if at all. That's not cowardice. That's democratic accountability operating exactly as designed in a system where governments answer to parliaments and publics, not to the preferences of an ally's executive branch. The argument is legally accurate. It is politically coherent, and it will continue to be made with increasing confidence in European capitals, as long as Washington's response to it is tweets and troop repositioning. But here's where the evidence diverges from the simple "Europe was right" reading. The countries refusing base access are the same countries bearing the economic cost of the Hormuz closure those operations are attempting to address. Spain, Italy, and France are absorbing elevated oil prices, elevated insurance premiums, disrupted supply chains. From the same disruption, the denied airspace is making harder to resolve. They are simultaneously refusing to facilitate the solution to a problem they are paying for. That's not hypocrisy. It's the documented output of domestic political systems where the cost of complicity arrives immediately and visibly, while the connection between base denial and extended economic disruption remains legible but diffuse. The political arithmetic is predictable. Predictable problems can be addressed, but only through the consultation process that prevents them from arising in the first place. And the naughty list is not addressing that process. Withdrawing 5,000 troops from Germany imposes costs on refusing allies. It does not create the consultation framework that generates political buy-in before the next operation begins. Every ally watching the troop withdrawal learns the same lesson. The cost of refusal is repositioning. They calculate whether that cost exceeds the domestic political cost of future compliance. For some, it will. For others, it won't. The outcome is case-by-case calculation instead of reliable commitment. That unpredictability, not the specific refusals in 2026, is the structural problem. And it is the problem that no amount of naughty list pressure resolves without a reformed consultation architecture. One more dimension that separated coverage consistently misses. Iran has been running two simultaneous tracks throughout this conflict. The military track, administrative control of the Strait of Hormuz, vessel stops, naval asset deployment. The sustained friction that makes commercial operators price the strait as high risk. The diplomatic track, Pakistani intermediary channels, ceasefire framework signals, Iraqi public statements suggesting movement. Both tracks benefit from extended American operational timelines. The longer each strike package takes to assemble, the longer each logistics cycle runs, the more the operational pressure on Iran's military posture is reduced relative to what the original campaign tempo promised. Iranian operational planners read the same news cycles. They assess the same operational consequences, and they calibrate it accordingly. The base denials delivered a structural gift to Iranian strategic patience, not through coordination, through the operational arithmetic of distance and cost. A campaign that costs more per sortie and takes longer per logistics cycle, drawing from a munition stockpile already documented as depleted, is a campaign whose political sustainability timeline is shorter than its operational requirements. Here's what the documented evidence says comes next, and what to watch for. Watch for the NATO institutional response, whether an extraordinary ministerial consultation on out-of-area operation protocols is scheduled, whether the alliance command structure produces any formal revision to frameworks governing member state obligations for non-Article 5 operations. Those institutional processes are the only mechanism through which structural breakdown becomes structural repair rather than the normalized baseline. Watch Eastern European behavior. Poland, the Baltic states, Romania. These are the allies for whom American forward presence is not an arrangement, but an active deterrence signal against the threat they experience as immediate. If Eastern European governments begin requesting more specific commitment language, pre-positioned equipment guarantees, binding security architecture that reduces dependence on American political follow-through, that behavioral signal tells you the naughty list mechanism has produced collateral damage in the relationships that matter most for European deterrence. Watch European defense budgets, the specific line items for joint European procurement, independent strike capability, intelligence infrastructure that reduces reliance on American platforms, will tell you whether European governments are recalibrating towards strategic autonomy in ways that compound the fracture or eventually complement it. Watch Brent crude. If sustained prices above $110 per barrel translate into European domestic political pressure that leaders publicly attribute to Hormuz disruption, and if opposition parties begin making the argument that base denials extended the disruption their governments are now complaining about, That is the mechanism through which European governments could recalibrate without appearing to capitulate to American pressure. Here is the honest structural assessment that the documented record supports. The alliance is not broken. 100,000 American troops across Europe are not leaving tomorrow. The deterrence architecture that has kept large-scale war out of Western Europe for 77 years has not been dismantled by 3 countries declining airspace access for one campaign. But the logistical assumption that underwrote every American global power projection plan for 3 generations, that European bases are always available for whatever Washington needs, is now documented as conditional. Conditional is fixable. Conditional requires a consultation framework that generates political buy-in before operations begin, not after. It requires Washington to treat allied domestic political realities as operational planning constraints rather than irritants to be managed on Truth Social. It requires NATO to develop clearer frameworks for out-of-area operations that give member governments a legitimate institutional process for contributing or for declining, rather than a binary choice between complete support and being accused of stabbing America in the back. None of that is beyond the alliance's capacity. All of it requires acknowledging what structural breakdown actually describes, rather than treating it as European drama about American toughness. The crack is in the foundation. The building is still standing. But every adversary planning staff on Earth, in Moscow, Beijing, Tehran, is reading Rutte's transcript right now with the same public documentation you just heard explained. And they're updating their models accordingly. That's new. That's documented. And the consequences are already accumulating in every logistics cycle that flies the longer route because Sigonella said no.